He just wanted to clean up his backyard. But when the workers started digging, the excavator's bucket hit something metallic. At first, everyone thought it was just an old piece of rebar, but as they cleared the dirt, they realized it was an actual safe buried underground. What they found inside made even the toughest workers burst into tears. Subscribe to the channel and be sure to comment where you're watching this video from. The afternoon sun leaned low over the neighborhood, casting long amber stripes across the cracked wooden fences and rusted gutters of the old quarter. The house at the end of Lark Street looked like it had stood there forever, its paint faded into the color of tired bone. It belonged to Harold Johnson, a 50-year-old widower whose life had slowed into quiet, deliberate motion. He was a man of calloused hands and careful habits, known by his neighbors as the kind of person who always greeted them with a slow nod before turning back to his own thoughts. Inside the small kitchen that smelled faintly of coffee and oil, Harold sat by the window and stared at the backyard. The ground there was uneven, spotted with clumps of dried grass and the remains of flower beds that had once been tended with care. Years ago, that patch of earth had been his wife's pride. She had spent mornings there, bent over her roses, humming old gospel tunes. When she died, something in the yard seemed to die with her. The weeds grew quickly after that, climbing over the fence and swallowing the forgotten garden. Harold's 2 children, Marcus and Lena, no longer lived with him full-time. They came on weekends when they could, bringing bursts of laughter that felt almost too loud for the quiet house. They were good kids, respectful, careful not to mention their mother too often. Harold appreciated the silence between them. It was the only way he knew how to keep the fragile peace that grief had left behind. He worked 6 days a week for a local construction company, operating heavy machinery, sometimes patching walls, sometimes digging foundations. His co-workers liked him well enough, though he never joined them for beers after work. When they laughed together, Harold usually stood at the edge of the group, his hands in his pockets, smiling in the polite way that means a man has learned to live with loneliness. Every Sunday morning, he cleaned the tools in his garage. The place had the smell of dust, metal, and motor oil. Rows of nails, screws, and washers filled glass jars along the shelves. In one corner stood a large wooden chest filled with the remnants of his wife's gardening supplies, worn gloves, a faded hat, packets of seeds now long expired. Sometimes, while sweeping, he would catch sight of that box and stop just for a moment before shaking the memory away. The yard beyond the garage had become a graveyard of forgotten projects. A wheelbarrow with a broken handle leaned against the fence. A pile of bricks, left from a job years ago, was half covered in moss. The ground was hard and dry, the kind of earth that resisted new beginnings. Yet, Harold couldn't stop thinking about changing it. For weeks now, he had been sketching something small on a notepad, a simple plan, drawn in pencil and smudged from his fingers. A circular patio, a wooden bench, maybe even a tiny pond. He wanted to build a space where he could sit quietly, a place to breathe again. It wasn't just about rebuilding the yard. It was about restoring something inside himself, a corner of peace he hadn't felt since the day of the funeral. He had already measured the space. On a humid Thursday evening, after finishing dinner, he took a piece of chalk from his toolbox and went outside. The ground was cool under his boots, the air carrying the faint buzz of distant traffic. He walked to the center of the yard and pressed the chalk to the dirt, marking the circle where the foundation of the patio would be. The line wasn't perfect, but that didn't matter. He stood back and looked at it for a long time. The sight of that white outline against the dark soil gave him a strange sense of calm. When he returned to the house, he sat in the dim light of the kitchen and allowed himself a rare, quiet satisfaction. For months, he had been living as if everything behind him was locked away, untouchable. But something about that circle outside whispered that not everything had to stay buried. He could start again, slowly, cautiously, but start nonetheless. The following weekend, he began clearing the ground. He used an old spade to cut through the overgrown weeds, his breath heavy in the warm air. Sweat gathered along his neck as he lifted chunks of earth and tossed them into a wheelbarrow. With each scoop, the yard began to change shape. It was exhausting, but in that exhaustion he found purpose. Every shovelful of dirt felt like he was peeling away a layer of grief. By afternoon, his shirt was soaked and his arms trembled from the work. He sat on the edge of the porch steps and looked at the progress. The earth lay open now, dark and raw, ready for something new. It was strange, he thought, how digging into the ground made him feel closer to the woman he'd lost. She had always said that the soil remembered kindness, that if you treated it gently, it gave back in ways you couldn't predict. That evening, after cleaning his tools, Harold wrote a short list on a piece of paper. Gravel, timber, nails, garden stones. He didn't have much money to spare, but he told himself he could buy the materials little by little. He taped the list to the refrigerator door where his children would see it the next time they came over. Maybe they'd help him on weekends, maybe not. Either way, the project was his now. The days stretched into one another. Each morning he left for work before sunrise, the air thick with the smell of dew and distant asphalt. Each evening, after returning home, he spent an hour in the yard, raking, planning, measuring again. He didn't tell anyone about what he was doing. The project was private, sacred in its simplicity. Sometimes, when the sun went down, he would stand in the yard with a cup of coffee, watching the fireflies rise from the grass like tiny floating embers. The silence comforted him. In that silence, he could almost hear her voice again, soft and close, telling him to keep going, to build something beautiful even from broken pieces. A week later, a small rental truck pulled up in front of his house. From it came an old yellow excavator, worn with years of use. Harold had rented it from a friend at the company, cheap but functional enough to dig out the deeper parts of the yard. The friend had warned him the machine was slow and temperamental, but Harold didn't mind. He wanted to do this himself, at his own pace. That night, he couldn't sleep. The thought of operating the excavator again, of moving the earth in wide, heavy strokes, made his hands itch with anticipation. It had been a long time since he'd felt that kind of focus. When dawn finally came, the neighborhood was still, wrapped in early mist. He walked outside, climbed into the machine, and turned the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, and came alive with a low growl. The yard looked small from the operator's seat. As he maneuvered the heavy arm of the excavator, he felt a rhythm return to his body, the rhythm of control, of creation. Each scoop of dirt fell neatly to the side, revealing layers of soil that hadn't seen daylight in decades. The smell of earth rose thick and damp in the morning air. He imagined what the space would look like when it was finished. The small patio, the wooden bench beneath the shade of the old oak, maybe a pond where his children could sit one day. It was a picture that made his chest ache in the best possible way. From the window of the kitchen, a neighbor waved at him, smiling. Harold raised a gloved hand in return, the motion easy and unthinking. He didn't realize it then, but that morning marked a quiet turning point in his life, the moment before discovery. before history began to reach out from under the soil to meet him. By noon, the sun burned fiercely above. The air shimmered with heat, and the rhythmic roar of the excavator echoed down the street. He was almost done for the day when the bucket struck something that didn't sound like stone or root. The noise was sharp, metallic, almost hollow. He frowned, paused the machine, and leaned out of the cab. The dirt below showed a faint glint of rusted metal. He didn't investigate further that day. He was tired, and the light was beginning to fade. Still, the strange metallic sound lingered in his thoughts long after he shut off the machine and covered it with a tarp. Lying in bed that night, he stared at the ceiling, listening to the creaks of the old house, and tried to tell himself it was nothing. An old pipe, maybe, or debris from past construction. But somewhere, deep inside, the unease stirred. He couldn't explain why, but he felt that the ground behind his house was keeping something secret, something that had been waiting a long time to be found. When the morning came, he would return to the yard and dig a little deeper. He would clear the dirt around that sound and see what lay beneath. For now, though, he closed his eyes, unaware that the circle he had drawn in chalk had marked not just the beginning of a new garden, but the entrance to a buried story, a story that would change everything he thought he knew about his home, his family, and the very soil he stood upon. The next day would not just be another day of work. It would be the day the earth decided to remember. The following morning arrived wrapped in a gray stillness, the kind of early light that softens everything it touches. Dew glistened on the tips of grass and shimmered across the windshield of the excavator like a thin veil of glass. Harold stepped out of the house, his coffee steaming in the cool air, the mug warm against his palm. He could still hear in his mind the sharp metallic sound from the day before, a note too deliberate to be dismissed as a buried pipe or scrap. It had been clear, heavy, resonant, as though something solid had struck the heart of the earth itself. He told himself not to make much of it. It was just another day of work. The machine was there, waiting under the tarp, the smell of diesel clinging to the morning like a memory of yesterday's labor. He sipped the last of his coffee, placed the mug on the porch rail, and walked toward the excavator. The neighborhood was barely awake. A dog barked a few streets over, the echo thin and far. A newspaper lay at the end of his driveway, soaked through with dew. When he climbed into the cabin and turned the key, the old engine sputtered again, before catching with a groan. The vibration pulsed through his hands and legs, grounding him in a rhythm he knew well. He adjusted the seat, checked the fuel gauge, and rested his fingers on the levers. The yard stretched before him, open and patient, as if it were holding its breath. The first few scoops went easily. Soil fell in slow arcs to the side, revealing darker, wetter layers beneath. Each movement of the bucket carved new lines in the landscape, lines that seemed to draw him deeper into something unknown. Then, just as he was preparing to smooth the ground, the sound came again. Clearer this time, louder, like a bell muffled in mud. He froze. The hydraulic hum of the machine seemed to fade away as he leaned forward, staring into the shallow pit below. For a moment, he didn't move. Then, he eased the bucket aside, shut off the engine, and climbed down. The silence that followed was total. Even the birds had stopped singing. The only sound was the faint hiss of cooling metal. Harold stepped into the pit carefully, boots sinking into the damp soil. He crouched and brushed away the loose dirt with his gloved hands. Beneath the layer of clay, a rust-colored surface caught the light. It was rough, but unmistakably shaped by human hands, flat planes meeting at a rounded corner. He brushed more vigorously until a small patch cleared completely. The texture was metallic, the color deep brown-orange like dried blood. He tapped it with a small stone. The tone that answered was hollow. For a long moment, he just stared, half expecting the earth to close over it again. What was this thing doing here? His first thought was that it might be an old water tank or part of an old furnace. But the shape was wrong. The corner he uncovered was too neat, the edge too deliberate. It wasn't a pipe or random debris, it was a box, a large one. He felt a thrill of something between curiosity and unease. There was a pull to it, as though the ground itself was inviting him to continue. He climbed out of the pit and retrieved his shovel. The sun had risen higher by then, burning away the morning mist and laying sharp shadows across the yard. Each strike of the shovel sent little tremors through his arms as he dug around the edges of the metal object. Bit by bit, the form revealed itself. A rectangular body, thick-walled, about 4 feet long, with a corroded seam running along its top. When the blade of his shovel struck one of the hinges, sparks jumped. The sound made him flinch. He paused, wiped his forehead with his sleeve, and leaned on the handle, breathing hard. The dirt around the object was stubborn, clinging to it like it didn't want to let go. He worked for hours, stripping away layer after layer until the sun climbed directly overhead. By noon, the outline was clear enough to confirm what he already suspected. It was a safe, old, heavy, and sealed tight by decades of rust. The keyhole was barely visible beneath the crust of time. Harold stood back, staring down at it, his heartbeat a dull throb in his ears. The last thing he had expected to find in his yard was something like this, a relic buried under ordinary ground. He took a few steps back and looked at the rest of the yard. The excavator stood still, its shadow stretching long and thin toward the fence. He tried to imagine the safe's journey, who had buried it, when, and why. The possibilities unfolded in his mind: hidden money, stolen goods, family heirlooms. But the more he thought about it, the stranger it seemed. Why bury something this large here, on land that had changed ownership several times over the last century? He turned off the engine completely, walked to the house, and fetched a long metal rod from the garage. He used it to probe the soil beneath the safe, testing for any additional metal. The rod met resistance once or twice, but nothing significant. The object seemed to be alone down there, like a single buried heart. It took the rest of the afternoon to free it. He fashioned a makeshift pulley with a pair of wooden beams and a length of steel cable he'd saved from work. The rig groaned under the strain as he levered the safe upward, inch by inch. Mud and water sloughed off its sides, splattering his boots. When the final section came free, the safe slid out of its earthen cradle with a wet, sucking sound and landed on the ground with a dull metallic thud. Harold stood over it, catching his breath. It was enormous. More than 200 pounds at least, scarred and pitted by time. The surface was mottled with rust blooms, and faint traces of what might once have been paint clung stubbornly to the corners. A small plaque was riveted to the front, but years of corrosion had erased whatever name or numbers had been inscribed there. He circled it slowly, one hand trailing along its edge. He thought of all the hands that must have touched it before his own, the stories it must contain. There was something solemn about it, something that made him feel both excited and uneasy. The weight of history pressed on him more heavily than the safe itself. He took a crowbar from the garage and knelt beside it, tapping lightly at the lock. The metal didn't budge. It would take more than brute strength to open it, and he wasn't sure he wanted to, not yet. Instead, he fetched a rag and began wiping away the layers of grime. Beneath the rust, he discovered a faint outline of initials, perhaps HJ or MT, he couldn't be sure. The letters were too worn to decipher. As the afternoon deepened into evening, shadows began to stretch across the yard again. The golden light made the safe's surface shimmer faintly, giving it an almost living appearance. He felt tired, but not the kind of tired that made him want to stop. It was the deep, fulfilling exhaustion of having uncovered something that mattered. When he finally decided to move it into the garage, it took every ounce of strength he had left. He rolled it onto an old piece of plywood and used the excavator's bucket to nudge it along the ground. The metal screeched against the floor, echoing through the quiet neighborhood. Once it was inside the garage, he stepped back and looked at it under the yellow light. It sat there like a sleeping animal, patient and inscrutable. He closed the garage door halfway and leaned against it, breathing in the heavy scent of soil and rust. He couldn't help but think of the years this thing had spent underground, untouched, waiting for someone to notice. It might have been there long before his house was built, before the streets had names, before the city had its skyline. That thought brought a strange sense of humility. People came and went, buildings rose and fell, yet this metal box had endured in silence. What secrets could last that long? What could survive a century of darkness? He wiped his hands on his jeans and turned off the light. As he stepped out into the cooling evening, he glanced once more at the shadowed shape inside. He didn't know it yet, but the discovery would soon reach beyond curiosity. It would begin to weave him into a history larger than his own, a history that had been buried deliberately, as if the earth itself had been chosen as a witness. That night, he dreamed of the safe. In the dream, it wasn't covered in rust, but polished and gleaming, its door slightly ajar, light spilling from within. He reached toward it, but before he could touch the handle, the ground began to tremble, and a deep voice, neither human nor distant, seemed to whisper from inside. He woke up drenched in sweat, the sound still echoing in his ears. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring into the dark. The window was open, and a soft breeze moved through the curtains. Somewhere outside, the wind brushed through the trees, making the branches creak like old bones. Sleep wouldn't return. He rose, pulled on his boots, and walked to the garage. The air inside was cool and still. He turned on the light. The safe sat exactly where he'd left it, unmoving, but its presence filled the space. He touched the cold metal surface again, half expecting it to feel different. It didn't. It was just steel, lifeless and heavy, but he could no longer convince himself that it was only that. He stood there for a long while, lost in the strange gravity of the moment. This wasn't the end of his work. It was the beginning. Tomorrow he would try to open it, or at least find a way to look inside. Whatever was waiting there had been sealed for reasons he could not yet guess. The house behind him was silent, the lights dim. In that silence, Harold felt both a chill and a promise. He was no longer simply rebuilding his backyard. He was unearthing something older, something the ground had chosen to remember when people no longer could. And though he didn't know it, that safe was about to change not just his yard, but the story of everything around it. The street, the house, and the man himself. Outside, the sky began to fade from blue to black. The last light of day slid across the safe's rusted surface, glinting like the brief memory of something sacred, then disappeared entirely. The night settled, heavy and unbroken, and beneath the hush of crickets and the hum of faraway traffic, the earth lay still again, quiet, as though waiting for the next touch that would awaken it once more. The following day unfolded beneath a pale, indifferent sky, a kind of stillness that seemed to seep into every corner of the neighborhood. Harold rose before dawn, his sleep light and fragmented, filled with uneasy dreams of iron and earth. The house was silent, except for the slow hum of the refrigerator and the faint creak of the old floorboards beneath his feet. He brewed a pot of coffee, but didn't drink much of it. His thoughts were already elsewhere, drifting towards the shape that waited for him in the garage. When he pushed open the garage door, a wave of cold, metallic air greeted him. There it was, the safe, sitting squarely in the middle of the concrete floor, massive and immovable as though it had always belonged there. In the soft light of morning, its rusted surface appeared darker, streaked with the faint sheen of dew that had crept in overnight. The object had a strange presence, something beyond the weight of its steel body. It filled the room not with menace but with a heavy silence, a silence that seemed almost aware. Harold stood there for a long time, studying it as if expecting the box to speak. The garage smelled of oil and dust, of old wood and faint mildew. Outside, the world was waking slowly, birds calling from the wires, the distant rumble of a delivery truck, but inside this space, time felt suspended. He knelt beside the safe and ran his fingers over the surface, tracing the ridges of rust and the faint outline of the lost initials. The metal was rough and cold against his skin, biting slightly at the edges. He could feel every scar it carried, every decade it had spent buried. He brought over a small workbench lamp and plugged it in, angling the yellow light directly over the lock. The metal gleamed faintly, revealing the intricate corrosion around the keyhole and hinges. He could almost imagine how it must have looked once, clean, solid, unyielding. But time had done its work well. The hinges were fused, and the lock seemed welded shut by rust. He fetched a can of penetrating oil from the shelf and sprayed it carefully along the edges, watching the dark liquid slide into the crevices and vanish. Then he sat back on his heels and waited, the quiet ticking of cooling metal filling the space. Every part of him wanted to see what was inside, but there was also hesitation, an instinctive caution. He didn't know what he might find. Money would have been simple, papers perhaps, but what if it was something else, something that carried a story he wasn't ready to touch? He thought briefly of calling someone from the company, maybe one of his co-workers who'd know how to open a safe properly. Yet the idea of sharing the discovery felt wrong. This was something he had uncovered with his own hands. It belonged, for the moment, to him and the earth that had hidden it. He took a crowbar from the tool rack, its handle worn smooth from years of use. With careful precision, he wedged the tip under the seam near the hinge and pushed gently. The metal didn't move. He adjusted his stance and tried again, putting more of his weight into it. The safe responded with a faint groan, the old iron complaining against its forced awakening. A single fleck of rust fell loose, then another. He paused, listening. Outside, the wind stirred the branches of the oak tree, and a dry leaf skittered across the driveway like a whisper. Harold gritted his teeth and pushed harder. The crowbar slipped slightly, scraping his knuckles against the metal. He hissed in pain and drew his hand back, watching a thin smear of blood bloom across his skin. For a moment, he just stood there, staring at it, the red vivid against the gray light. Then he wiped it on his jeans and continued. This time, the sound that came was deeper, a grinding, tearing shriek as the hinge began to surrender. The smell of rust and earth mixed with oil filled the air, thick and acrid. After nearly an hour of slow, deliberate effort, the door shifted enough to reveal a thin crack along the seam. Harold wedged a screwdriver into the gap and twisted, forcing it wider. A sudden rush of stale air escaped, carrying with it the scent of decay, paper, and something faintly sweet, like old fabric that had been locked away too long. He froze, his heart pounding. The safe seemed to breathe out, releasing the trapped breath of decades. When he finally pulled the door open, it came with a long, drawn-out creak. Inside, the darkness was almost complete. Dust swirled in the narrow beam of the lamp, curling like smoke. He leaned closer, squinting, and saw that the contents were not what he'd expected. There were no coins, no jewelry, no gold. Instead, resting inside like relics in a tomb, were small, intimate things. A folded blanket, a small box, a bundle of letters tied together with a faded ribbon. And, beneath them all, a photograph, its edges yellowed and curling. He reached in slowly, afraid that the objects might disintegrate at his touch. The air inside was dry and cold, heavy with the smell of time. He lifted the blanket first. It was delicate, made of fine wool, worn thin but still soft. When he unfolded it, he realized it was a child's blanket, embroidered along the edge with a faint pattern of stars. Beneath it lay the box, a small wooden one with a simple latch. He opened it carefully and found inside a handful of small trinkets: a broken pocket watch, a child's wooden toy car, a few tarnished coins, and a silver medal, its inscription nearly erased. He stared at the items, struck by their tenderness. These weren't valuables, they were mementos. Someone had sealed away the fragments of a life, not for profit, but for remembrance. Harold's throat tightened as he picked up the bundle of letters. The ribbon came apart easily, disintegrating under his fingers. He unfolded the top letter. The paper was fragile, its ink faded to a soft brown, but the handwriting was careful, elegant. He could read only a few lines before the words blurred in his vision. The letter spoke of fear, of change, of a promise to return once the storm had passed. It mentioned names he didn't know and a street that no longer existed. The final lines were simple, almost pleading. "If you find this, remember us." He set the letter down and picked up the photograph. It showed a family standing in front of a house that looked startlingly familiar. A man, a woman, and 2 children, a boy and a girl, stood smiling beside a tree that could easily have been the same oak that grew in Harold's backyard. The resemblance was uncanny. The boy in the photo clutched a toy car identical to the one in the box. On the back of the photograph, written in the same careful hand, were the words, "We will come home when the storm is over." Harold sat back on the cold floor, his body tense, his heart hammering. The garage felt smaller now, its walls pressing close. He couldn't shake the feeling that the past was somehow watching him. The realization came slowly, but with the weight of certainty. The house in the photograph wasn't just similar to his own. It was the same one. The roof line, the fence, even the position of the windows matched. The people in the picture had lived here long before he had, maybe before his parents had even been born. He looked again at the photograph, tracing the faint outlines of their faces with his thumb. The man had strong shoulders, a quiet dignity. The woman's eyes carried a softness that reminded him of his late wife. The children's smiles were wide and bright, untouched by whatever storm the letter had warned of. He wondered what had happened to them. Why had they buried their memories beneath the soil? What had driven them away? The air in the garage felt heavier now, as though the space itself was absorbing his questions. He stood, pacing slowly, his mind reeling with possibilities. It could have been a time capsule, an attempt to preserve their story. Or perhaps it had been something more desperate, a family forced to leave, hiding their most precious things in the hope of one day returning. He found himself speaking softly, though there was no one to hear. "You came before me," he murmured, "and you left this here for someone like me to find." The words hung in the air, swallowed by the hum of the fluorescent light above. He placed the photograph on the workbench, arranging the letters and trinkets beside it. For the first time in years, he felt tears sting his eyes. They weren't tears of sorrow or joy, but something deeper. A recognition, an understanding that the pain he carried wasn't his alone. Others had lived and loved and lost on this same ground, and their echoes had waited patiently beneath the surface for someone to listen. He cleaned the items gently, laying them out in the order he had found them. The photograph at the center, the letters fanned around it, the small toy and metal at the edges. It looked like a small museum of forgotten lives. The safe, once a fortress of secrecy, now felt like a doorway, an opening between what had been and what was. As the light outside faded to dusk, Harold stayed in the garage, unable to leave the things alone. He felt responsible for them now. He covered them with a clean cloth to protect them from dust, then sat on his stool and watched the cloth rise and fall slightly with each draft of air. The shadows deepened, the corners of the room growing darker until the only light left was the glow of the workbench lamp reflecting off the safe's rough surface. It was strange, he thought, how something forgotten could find its way back into the world. The people in the photograph were gone, but their story had waited patiently for nearly a century, silent but unbroken. Perhaps that was what the earth did best, it remembered. It kept the traces of every hand that had touched it, every step that had crossed it, every seed of memory it was asked to protect. When Harold finally turned off the lamp, the darkness felt different. Not empty, but full, alive with the weight of what had been uncovered. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking back one last time before closing the garage door. The safe sat quiet and still, its door open now, its secret given up. Yet the silence it left behind was not one of completion, but of continuation, as if the story had only just begun to breathe again. That night, as Harold lay in bed, he couldn't sleep. He kept seeing the faces from the photograph in his mind, the gentle eyes of the woman, the determined jaw of the man, the children's bright smiles. He imagined their laughter filling the same rooms he now walked through in silence. He wondered if they had planted the oak tree, if their footsteps had once followed the same worn path from the kitchen to the back porch. The sound of the wind outside was steady, low, like the slow rhythm of memory itself. Harold turned onto his side and stared through the window at the faint outline of the tree against the night sky. Somewhere beneath its roots, time had hidden their story, and now in his hands it had begun to speak again. He didn't know what he would do next, only that he couldn't leave the mystery buried any longer. The letters mentioned a storm, a promise to return, a hope that someone would remember. He would start there. Tomorrow, he decided, he would go to the library, maybe the historical office, find out who had lived in this house before him. He owed it to them, and to himself, to understand the story the earth had chosen him to uncover. The garage slept behind him, its silence unbroken. But beneath that silence, something had shifted. The ground itself, once only soil and root, had become a map of ghosts and voices. And in that quiet, Harold's life, too, had begun to change. Slowly, deeply, like a seed remembering how to grow after a long winter underground. The next morning arrived gray and heavy, as though the sky itself had been weighed down by the thoughts Harold carried through the night. He hadn't slept much. The safe, the letters, the photograph, all of it lingered behind his eyes, refusing to let him rest. By dawn, the decision had already formed in his mind. He needed answers. Whatever story those people had left behind, he owed it to them, and perhaps to himself, to find the truth. He poured his coffee into a chipped mug and drank it standing by the window, staring out at the oak tree in the backyard. Its roots spread far and deep beneath the soil, the same soil that had hidden the safe for all those years. The air outside was still damp from last night's drizzle, and the grass shimmered faintly under the first hints of sunlight. For a brief moment, he imagined that family again. The man, the woman, the children, standing by the same tree, the wind brushing through their hair. The image filled him with a quiet ache. After finishing his coffee, he gathered the letters, the photograph, and the medal, and wrapped them carefully in a clean cloth. He placed them inside a small box, the same one where he used to keep his wife's gardening tools, and locked the garage. As he stepped out into the street, the morning city began to hum around him. The low growl of engines, the distant bark of a dog, a child calling after his mother. But for Harold, the world felt different now. Every noise seemed muted, every motion slower, as though time itself was waiting for him to uncover what had been forgotten. The public library stood at the edge of the old district, its brick facade softened by age and ivy. Inside, the air smelled of paper, dust, and something faintly floral, like dried lavender. The librarian, a woman in her 60s with silver hair pinned neatly in a bun, greeted him with a polite nod as he approached the counter. She recognized his uncertainty immediately. People who came here searching for the past always had the same look. He explained that he was researching the history of his property, that he'd recently found some old documents and a photograph, and wanted to know who had lived there before. She listened carefully, her expression a mixture of curiosity and quiet understanding. When he mentioned the approximate location, her brows lifted slightly. "That area," she said softly, "has quite a history." She led him to a back room lined with shelves of old ledgers and microfilm reels. The hum of the fluorescent lights above was steady, almost hypnotic. She showed him how to use the reader, how to scroll through the reels of archived newspapers. Harold thanked her and began his search. At first, the blur of old text and images passed meaninglessly before his eyes. Advertisements for long-closed shops, reports of town meetings, small local tragedies that time had swallowed whole. But then a headline caught his attention. "Fire destroys home on Willow Avenue. Family missing." The date was 1922. The photograph accompanying the article was grainy, but the burned skeleton of the house looked painfully familiar. He leaned closer, his pulse quickening. The article described how a blaze had erupted late one night, consuming the home of a family named Johnson. No relation to him, but the coincidence of the name made him pause. The details were sparse. Neighbors reported hearing shouting, seeing smoke. The father, Henry Johnson, was a respected craftsman. His wife Evelyn, known for her charity work. 2 children, a boy and a girl, were listed as missing. The article ended abruptly, stating only that the cause of the fire was under investigation. There was no follow-up, no report of remains found, no mention of where the family had gone. Harold sat back, staring at the flickering projection on the screen. The name Johnson echoed in his mind. It was his own surname. He had never known of any relatives from this city. But what if... The thought felt absurd, yet strangely possible. His family had moved north generations ago. Records from that far back were patchy. Could the people in the photograph, the ones who had written those letters, have been his ancestors? He shook the thought away, telling himself it didn't matter whether they were related or not. What mattered was the truth of what had happened to them. He turned the reels again, scanning for follow-up stories, but found nothing. It was as if the family had simply vanished after that night. The librarian returned, carrying a large, leather-bound registry. "You might find something here," she said. "These are property records from the early 20th century." She placed it gently before him and left him to his search. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but he managed to trace the ownership of his address. The same name appeared again and again until 1923, when it was replaced by the city's redevelopment office. After that, there was a long gap, nearly 2 decades, before private ownership resumed. He ran his hand slowly across the paper. The city had taken the property after the fire, demolished what was left, and rebuilt years later. Whatever had once stood there was gone. Except, of course, for the safe buried beneath the ground, the one thing the flames and the passage of time hadn't erased. Harold closed the book and sat in silence. Around him, the library seemed to breathe softly, the air thick with the scent of ink and old paper. He thought of the letter's final words: "If you find this, remember us." Perhaps that was what they had wanted all along, not to be forgotten. The safe, the photograph, the letters, they weren't treasures meant to enrich anyone. They were evidence, a testimony left behind when their voices had been taken. The librarian returned once more and handed him a photocopy of a small article she had found. It was from 1923, a notice of city council proceedings. One of the entries mentioned compensation denied to the Johnson family, claim unsubstantiated. The words stung like a quiet injustice. Compensation denied, claim unsubstantiated. As if the fire that had destroyed their lives hadn't even been real enough for the city to acknowledge. Harold thanked her and left the library as the afternoon light slanted gold through the tall windows. The streets outside were busy, yet the noise felt distant, as though separated by a pane of invisible glass. His thoughts circled endlessly around the same questions. What if the fire hadn't been an accident? What if the storm mentioned in the letters wasn't a metaphor, but something darker, a time of violence or persecution? He had heard stories growing up, whispers about neighborhoods that had been burned out during riots, about families forced to flee their homes under the cover of night. Maybe this was one of those stories. When he reached home, he went straight to the garage and laid out the items again. The photograph seemed to look back at him with quiet patience. He noticed now what he hadn't before: faint scorch marks at the bottom edge, as though it had survived the fire itself. The letters, too, carried faint brown stains, the edges crisped but intact. Whoever had buried them must have done so after the fire, not before. Someone had survived. Someone had chosen to hide these things and leave a message behind. That night, Harold sat at the kitchen table long after sunset, the documents spread before him. He could hear the faint rustle of leaves outside, the sigh of wind through the old oak. He imagined the man from the photograph standing in that same spot 100 years earlier, writing those words by lamplight, aware that the world around him was turning hostile. "If you find this, remember us." He felt a pang of guilt then. How many years had he lived in this house, never knowing what had happened here, never realizing that beneath his feet lay the remnants of someone's pain, someone's love. The ground he had walked across so casually had once been sacred, a place of both life and loss. He wondered how many others in the neighborhood lived atop such stories, unaware of what the earth remembered. Over the next few days, Harold's curiosity grew into obsession. He took notes, mapped out a timeline of events, compared the handwriting on the letters to known historical documents from the period. He even contacted the local historical society, explaining that he had found some artifacts that might relate to the city's early African American community. They agreed to send someone to examine them. At night, he dreamed of smoke. He saw the house as it once was, bright, full of laughter, and then watched as flames consumed it, licking up the walls, devouring the roof. He always woke before the end, heart pounding, his throat dry. It felt as though the past was trying to speak to him, to fill in the silence that history had left behind. When the historian finally arrived, a young woman named Dr. Moore, she handled the objects with reverence. As she read the letters, her expression grew solemn. She explained that there had indeed been racial unrest in the region around that time, that many black families had been driven out under the guise of urban renewal or false accusations. The fire, she said quietly, might not have been an accident at all. Harold listened in silence, a chill crawling along his spine. Everything she said made sense, though it hurt to hear it. The family in the photograph hadn't fled the weather. They had fled hatred. The storm in their letter was not a metaphor for hardship, but for fear. After she left, Harold sat alone in the fading light of evening. The garage door was open, the air cool and filled with the scent of earth. He looked at the safe again, now empty of its burden, and realized it wasn't just a container of the past, it was a mirror of his own life. He had buried his grief much the same way, sealing it away under layers of silence, hoping that it would never surface. But the earth had a way of revealing what was hidden. And sometimes, when the time was right, it made sure that what was buried would be found. He went out to the yard then and stood beneath the oak tree. The leaves whispered softly above him, catching the last light of the day. Beneath his feet lay the hollow where the safe had rested for decades. He could still see the faint mark in the soil, a scar that would fade with time but never truly disappear. He closed his eyes and thought of the family who had once stood there, their laughter echoing through the same air. The sky darkened and the first stars appeared. Somewhere in the distance a train horn blew, long and low, like the voice of the past calling through the years. Harold took a deep breath and whispered into the night, "I remember you." It wasn't a promise or a prayer. It was a recognition, a quiet vow that the story they had left behind would not vanish again. The storm had passed, and the earth had spoken. What remained now was memory, fragile but enduring, waiting to be carried forward into the light. For several days after Dr. Moore's visit, Harold lived in a quiet haze, caught between the weight of what he had learned and the deeper questions that still refused to let him rest. The safe had been opened, its contents studied and carefully wrapped again, but the silence it left behind seemed louder than ever. He found himself returning to the garage each evening, switching on the small yellow lamp and standing before the cleared space on the workbench, as if waiting for something else to rise from the earth. It was not enough to know what had happened. He needed to understand the shape of the truth that had been buried, the full extent of the injustice that had erased a family and left behind only a whisper in the soil. One gray morning, he decided that he could no longer wait for others to tell him what the past had hidden. He took a notebook, a pencil, and the copies of the letters and photograph he had made with Dr. Moore's guidance. He would go himself to the city archives, the place where the oldest records slept. The thought of those rooms filled with ledgers, papers, and the faint smell of dust stirred something deep in him, a feeling both reverent and determined, as though he were setting out on a pilgrimage. The archive building stood near the river, a long stone structure that had once been a courthouse. Its walls bore the stains of age, and the air inside was cool and dry. A man at the front desk, bespectacled and polite, listened as Harold explained that he was researching property records and personal documents related to a house on Willow Avenue. The man nodded with quiet efficiency, leading him through a corridor where the light filtered through tall windows in long, pale beams, and into a reading room filled with the soft rustle of turning pages. The archivist handed him a stack of index cards and pointed toward a row of cabinets where property registries were stored. Harold sat down and began leafing through the cards, his fingers tracing names and numbers written in neat black ink nearly a century ago. The quiet around him was almost sacred. Every sound, from the creak of a chair to the distant click of a typewriter in another room, seemed magnified. It felt as though the building itself demanded silence in exchange for revealing its secrets. It took hours before he found the first trace, a record of the Johnson family, dated 1915. The document listed the purchase of the house by Henry and Evelyn Johnson, a small note in the margin indicating that Henry was a craftsman by trade. The signature at the bottom of the page was strong and deliberate, the ink slightly blurred as though pressed down by a firm hand. Harold felt a shiver of recognition. The name was no longer just a line on paper. It was the same man whose face had smiled up from the photograph in his garage. He copied the reference number carefully, then asked to see any additional documents tied to the property. The archivist disappeared for several minutes and returned carrying 2 heavy folders. Harold opened them slowly, his eyes moving across brittle papers that smelled faintly of smoke and time. There were building permits, tax records, and, tucked between them, a thin envelope stamped with the city's seal. Inside was a typewritten report dated 1923. The words leapt from the page in their cold detachment. Property condemned following incident of fire. Cause undetermined. Owner not located. Below that, in smaller type, claim for damages denied due to lack of sufficient evidence. He read the line again and again, each word cutting a little deeper. Owner not located. It was as if the family had ceased to exist overnight, their disappearance folded neatly into the bureaucracy of loss. He imagined them fleeing into the night, their faces illuminated by the glow of their burning home, clutching the few things they could save. Somewhere among the chaos, they must have hidden the safe, buried it in the yard with trembling hands, hoping it would survive even if they could not. As he turned the pages, another document caught his eye, a handwritten complaint filed months earlier by Henry Johnson. The ink was faded, the cursive slanted and hurried. It spoke of threats made by unidentified men, of vandalism and broken windows, of warnings to leave the neighborhood before it was too late. The paper trembled in Harold's hands. There, in those few desperate sentences, was the truth that the fire reports had ignored. The Johnsons hadn't been victims of chance. They had been targeted. He sat back, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The room seemed to close around him, filled with the invisible presence of all the voices that had been silenced in the name of progress. The archivist looked over briefly from his desk but said nothing, sensing perhaps that Harold was in conversation with something larger than the documents before him. He spent the rest of the afternoon piecing together fragments, maps showing the neighborhood as it had been a century ago, lists of property transfers that revealed how, in the years following the fire, entire blocks had changed hands. Where once there had been a vibrant community of black craftsmen and teachers, there were now warehouses and vacant lots. The names that had once filled the registry, Johnson, Ellis, Carter, Wright, disappeared abruptly, replaced by developers and city agencies. It was a pattern written in quiet erasure, and it made Harold's stomach twist with anger. As dusk began to seep into the corners of the room, he found himself staring at one last photograph in the archives, a panoramic shot taken sometime in the early 1920s, showing the neighborhood from above. He traced his finger along the row of houses until he found the familiar outline of what would later become his own. There, barely visible, was the faint shape of the oak tree, smaller, younger, but unmistakably the same. Beneath it, he imagined the Johnson family standing, the children playing at its roots, unaware of the storm that would soon engulf them. When he left the archives, the evening air felt sharp against his skin. The sun had set, leaving the sky streaked with violet and ash. He walked along the riverbank, the city lights flickering in reflection across the dark water. In his pocket, his fingers brushed against the photocopies he had taken, the property record, the letter of complaint, the condemnation notice. Each paper was a thread in a tapestry of forgotten grief, and now that tapestry was his to preserve. That night, back in his kitchen, he spread the documents across the table. The light above cast deep shadows over the words, as though even now the past was reluctant to be seen too clearly. He could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the occasional sigh of wind against the windows. The house, which had always been so quiet, now seemed alive with echoes. He thought of his children, of how one day they might sit here too, learning that the place they called home had been built on bones of history. He wrote notes in his notebook long into the night, connecting dates and names, sketching a timeline that stretched from 1915 to the present day. The story was beginning to take shape, not as a legend, but as a record, one that demanded acknowledgement. He knew then that he would not keep this to himself. The Johnsons deserved more than silence. The next morning, he returned to the Historical Society with everything he had found. Dr. Moore was there, surprised but glad to see him. Together they examined the papers, and she nodded slowly as she read, her eyes dark with empathy. "This," she said softly, "isn't just one family's story. It's part of a much larger one." They spoke for hours about how to preserve the materials properly, how to document the site in Harold's backyard as a place of historical significance. She promised to reach out to local universities, to scholars who could verify the evidence and perhaps locate living descendants of the Johnson family. Her dedication steadied him. What had begun as a solitary discovery was now expanding into a shared act of remembrance. When Harold left the society building that afternoon, he felt something shift inside him, a quiet pride mingled with sorrow. He understood that he was not just unearthing the past, he was helping to give it voice again. The idea filled him with a strange, humbling gratitude. It was as though the family had chosen him for this task, the man who had once sought only to rebuild his garden, now rebuilding a history that had been buried for generations. Back at home, he walked out into the yard and stood beneath the oak tree once more. The evening light spilled through the branches, dappling the grass with gold. The soil where the safe had lain was still soft, the grass struggling to grow back. He knelt and pressed his palm against the earth, feeling the cool dampness against his skin. Beneath that touch, he imagined the pulse of memory, steady and alive. The past was not gone. It was breathing through him, waiting to be told. Inside, the photograph of the Johnson family rested on his mantelpiece beside a picture of his own children. The two families seemed to gaze toward one another across time, a silent acknowledgement that loss, when shared, could become a form of healing. Harold poured himself a glass of water and looked around the room. The house no longer felt empty. It felt inhabited by something enduring, something true. He knew there was still much to uncover, more records to examine, more questions to answer. But the path was clear now. The city archives had given him the evidence he needed. The letters had given him the heart. And in the space between those two, fact and feeling, lay the story he was meant to tell. As the night deepened, he sat by the window and listened to the steady chorus of crickets outside. The safe in the garage stood open and silent, its purpose fulfilled. But the story it had carried was no longer locked away. It had risen from the soil, passed through his hands, and now belonged once more to the world above ground. The truth, fragile as it was, had survived. And Harold, weary but certain, vowed to protect it, not out of duty alone, but out of reverence for those who had trusted the earth to keep their memory alive until someone, at last, came looking. The days that followed Harold's visit to the archives unfolded in a strange, charged stillness, as though the air itself had grown more aware of him. He moved through his home differently now. Each creak of the floorboards, each breath of wind through the oak outside, felt heavy with meaning. The past had stopped being an abstract idea. It was alive all around him, whispering through the walls, breathing beneath the earth. He had brought something back with him from those cold, dust-laden rooms, something more than documents and copies of names. He had brought back a pulse of memory, a story that refused to remain buried. Dr. Moore called him 2 days later. Her voice, calm but quick with excitement, told him that she had shared his findings with her colleagues at the university. A small team of historians wanted to come to his home to see the artifacts for themselves and verify what he had uncovered. She asked if he would be willing to host them. Harold hesitated only for a moment before agreeing. It wasn't pride that moved him, nor curiosity. It was obligation. The Johnsons deserved witnesses. Their story had been erased once, and he would not let it vanish again. On the morning of their visit, the house seemed unnaturally quiet. He had cleaned the garage the night before, sweeping the floor until the concrete shone and rearranging the workbench so the photograph, letters, and trinkets lay neatly in a row under the soft glow of the lamp. He stood before them now, his hands resting on the edge of the table, studying the faces in the faded photograph as though preparing them for company. "They're coming to see you," he said softly, the words almost a prayer. "This time, people will listen." The first car arrived just before 10. Dr. Moore stepped out, carrying a leather satchel and a folder of notes. 2 other historians followed her, one middle-aged man with kind eyes behind thick glasses, and a younger woman with a camera slung over her shoulder. They greeted Harold warmly, but with a professional restraint, as though stepping into sacred ground. He led them to the garage, where they stopped short at the sight of the safe. Even empty, it commanded attention. Its rusted surface glimmered faintly under the lamplight, a relic of silence that had finally surrendered its voice. Dr. Moore introduced each of them and explained the plan. They would document everything: the artifacts, the safe's interior, the soil composition of the excavation site. Harold listened quietly as they began their work, moving with careful precision, measuring, photographing, and recording. Each motion carried a reverence that made him strangely proud. It was as if they were performing a ritual of remembrance, one that transformed his ordinary garage into something resembling a shrine. As the hours passed, the small space filled with murmurs of discussion and the soft clicking of the camera. Dr. Moore handled the letters with gloved hands, her brow furrowed in concentration as she translated the faded handwriting into clean, modern notes. The older historian examined the metal, turning it gently between his fingers. "This is remarkable," he murmured. "Local manufacture, early 20th century, Civilian Service Award perhaps linked to community work." Harold nodded but said little. He preferred to watch, to let their careful attention speak for him. The younger woman, kneeling beside the photograph, looked up at him once. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. "They look happy." He managed a small smile. "They were," he replied, "at least for a while." By afternoon, the garage was filled with a low, golden light that softened every shadow. The team had completed their initial study, and Dr. Moore suggested they take a short break. She followed Harold into the kitchen, while the others packed away their equipment. They sat at the table where he had once pored over his notes alone, but now the space felt different, alive with the quiet hum of purpose. "Do you know what this means, Harold?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. "These records, these objects, they confirm a part of our city's history that was nearly lost. The fire, the threats, the disappearance of that entire neighborhood. It wasn't just neglect, it was erasure. What you found is proof of that." He looked down at his hands, the calloused fingers resting against the wood grain of the table. "It's strange," he said slowly. "I've lived here all these years and never knew any of it. And now I can't stop thinking about them. About how they must have felt when the fire started, when they realized they'd have to leave everything behind. It's like I can still feel them here." Dr. Moore smiled sadly. "Maybe that's because they are here," she said. "You gave them a voice again. Sometimes that's all it takes for the past to live." As the afternoon stretched on, the historians continued their work outside, taking soil samples and photographs of the yard. Harold followed them to the spot beneath the oak tree where the safe had been buried. The grass had begun to regrow, soft and green, but the scar in the earth was still visible, a reminder of what lay beneath. The older historian stood quietly, hands clasped behind his back. "You know," he said, glancing toward the tree, "this ground could very well be considered a site of historical importance. It's part of a story people need to hear." The words lingered in Harold's mind long after they left. That evening, when the last car disappeared down the street, he returned to the yard and sat beneath the oak. The light was fading, the horizon brushed with the faintest trace of rose and gold. He could still smell the damp earth, still see the faint outlines of where the team had worked. Above him, the leaves rustled softly in the breeze, and for a moment he imagined the whispers of a family long gone. A man's low voice, a woman's laughter, the shrill joy of children playing among the roots. He closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him until it became something more than imagination. It became memory. Over the next few weeks, news of the discovery began to spread. Local reporters called, curious about the century-old safe found in a suburban backyard. Dr. Moore handled most of the inquiries, careful to frame the story not as a spectacle but as a restoration of history. The city council reached out as well, expressing interest in recognizing the site officially. Harold was both proud and uneasy. He had never sought attention, but he couldn't deny the sense of justice in seeing the Johnson story finally brought into the light. One afternoon, he stood in the library again, this time not as a loan seeker, but as a bearer of something precious. The librarian who had first helped him recognized him instantly. "You found them, didn't you?" she said softly. He nodded, placing a small stack of documents on her desk. "They deserve a place here," he told her. "Somewhere safe." She accepted the papers with a solemn nod. "We'll make sure they're never forgotten again." That night, as rain began to fall softly against the roof, Harold sat at his desk and wrote. He wrote not as a researcher or a witness, but as a man speaking to those who could no longer answer. He addressed the letter simply, "To the Johnson family." The words came slowly at first, halting and unsure, but soon they flowed like the rain outside, steady and unbroken. He told them what had become of their home, of the oak that still stood strong, of the safe that had waited patiently for nearly a century to be found. He told them that the truth had been seen, that people were listening again, and that their names would not fade. When he finished, he folded the letter and placed it inside the safe, which now stood open in the corner of the garage. It felt right that the story should rest where it had begun. He touched the cool edge of the metal door and whispered, "You're home now." Then he turned off the light and left the safe in darkness once more. Not the darkness of concealment, but of peace. Weeks passed, and with them came changes. The city approved the historical recognition of his property, and plans were made for a small memorial to be built in the yard. Harold worked alongside the volunteers who came to help, guiding them with quiet pride. He watched as the stone marker was set into the earth near the oak tree, its surface engraved with simple words, "In memory of those who lived, loved, and were lost, but not forgotten." When the day of the dedication arrived, the sky was clear and full of light. Neighbors gathered, along with members of the Historical Society, reporters, and even a few distant relatives of the Johnson family whom Dr. Moore had managed to locate. They were elderly now, but their presence filled the air with something unspoken and sacred. As the speeches began, Harold stood at the back, his hands folded before him, listening to the words that honored a family he had never met yet felt bound to forever. When the crowd dispersed, he remained alone beneath the oak, watching as the last of the guests drifted away. The plaque gleamed softly in the sunlight, and for a long time he said nothing. Then, quietly, he began to hum. It was the tune his wife had once sung while tending her garden, a simple, wordless melody. It rose through the still air and mingled with the rustle of the leaves above. In that sound, the past and the present seemed to fold together, the laughter of children, the sorrow of loss, the resilience of memory, all carried on the same note. That night, the house felt alive again. The walls no longer echoed with emptiness, but with warmth, as though the years of silence had been gently swept away. Harold sat by the window, the light from the memorial shining faintly in the yard beyond. He realized then that the story of the safe was never really about discovery. It was about restoration, the act of giving back what time and cruelty had stolen. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, the scent of rain and soil still lingering in the air. The world outside was quiet, but not empty. The past was no longer buried, and neither was he. In the heart of the city, beneath the branches of an old oak tree, Two families, one living, one remembered, had finally found their peace together. And for the first time in many years, Harold felt that the house he had inherited, the home he had rebuilt, had at last become whole. The morning after the dedication, Harold woke before the sun. The house was wrapped in a thin, bluish stillness, the kind that settles just before dawn when the world seems to pause between dreams and waking. He sat at the edge of his bed for a while, listening to the faint ticking of the clock in the hall, the slow rhythm of his own breathing. The air smelled faintly of rain and cut grass, the scent drifting in from the open window. For the first time in many years, the silence in his home did not feel like absence. It felt like peace. When he stepped outside, the yard was glazed with dew. The oak tree loomed above him, vast and ancient, its leaves trembling softly in the early breeze. The new stone marker near its roots gleamed faintly under the rising light, its inscription catching the sun as though the words themselves were waking. In memory of those who lived, loved, and were lost, but not forgotten. He traced the letters with his fingers, feeling the cool stone beneath his skin. The simple sentence seemed to hum with life, as though the earth itself had spoken it. It had been only a few days since the dedication ceremony, but already the yard felt transformed. Where once there had been an empty patch of ground, there was now a place of quiet reverence. Neighbors who passed by often paused at the fence, leaning over to read the plaque or simply to stand in silence for a moment. Sometimes children would stop their bikes and stare, their young faces puzzled but curious, as though sensing that something sacred rested there. Harold never stopped them. He wanted them to see, to wonder, to remember. He spent that morning working with his hands, something he hadn't done in months. The act of labor had always calmed him, and now it carried new meaning. He rebuilt the small bench he had once planned to place in the yard, sanding the planks until the wood felt smooth and warm beneath his palms. He set it beside the oak, facing the memorial, and when he sat down, the air around him felt heavier, rooted. The soil beneath his feet was no longer just dirt, it was memory. It was inheritance. As the day brightened, he was joined by his daughter, Lena. She had driven from the city after hearing about the memorial, wanting to see it for herself. When she stepped into the yard, she stopped short, her eyes wide. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "I saw pictures online, but I didn't expect it to feel like this." Harold smiled faintly. "It's not just a marker," he said. "It's a promise." She looked at him, puzzled. He gestured toward the stone. "A promise that the past won't disappear again, that we won't forget the people who came before us." He told her the story then, not all at once, but in slow, measured words. About the safe, the letters, the photograph, about the fire, the family, and the discovery that had changed everything. She listened in silence, her gaze fixed on the plaque as he spoke. When he finished, Lena sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap. "You did the right thing," she said softly. "You gave them back their voice." She looked toward the tree, her expression thoughtful. "It's strange," she added after a moment. "It feels like they're still here, like they never really left." "They never did," Harold said. He tilted his head toward the branches swaying above them. "The earth keeps what we leave behind. It remembers." They sat together for a long time, watching the light shift through the leaves. The city beyond the fence stirred awake, the sound of traffic rising, a distant siren, the faint laughter of children walking to school. But here, within the small circle of the yard, time seemed to move differently. The air was filled with the quiet pulse of continuity, a heartbeat stretching across generations. Later that afternoon, a group from the local museum arrived to photograph the site for their upcoming exhibit on lost neighborhoods. Harold guided them through the yard, answering questions patiently, showing them where the safe had been found. They spoke in low, respectful tones, careful not to disturb the stillness of the place. When they were done, one of them, a young man with a notebook tucked under his arm, asked if Harold had ever considered writing down his account of everything that had happened. He hesitated, the question lingering in the air. He had kept notes, pages upon pages of scribbled thoughts, timelines, and observations, but he had never thought of shaping them into something more. The young man smiled. "You're part of the story now," he said. "People will want to know how it was found, what it meant to you. Stories like this don't just belong to history books, they belong to hearts." That night, Harold couldn't sleep. The idea of writing kept circling in his thoughts like the slow drift of wind through the oak leaves. He went to the garage, switched on the lamp, and sat at the small wooden desk he had built years ago. The photograph of the Johnson family still stood framed beside his own family's picture, the two images side by side as if they belonged together. He opened a fresh notebook and began to write. The words came easily at first, then more slowly, as though guided by something larger than himself. He described the day he found the safe, the sound of the excavator striking metal, the first glimpse of rust beneath the soil, the trembling moment when the door had opened to reveal not gold or money, but pieces of a family's life. He wrote about the smell of the letters, the softness of the blanket, the way the photograph had seemed to look back at him with knowing eyes. Hours passed unnoticed. When he finally stopped, the first light of dawn had begun to creep through the garage window. His hands ached, but his heart felt lighter than it had in years. He closed the notebook and sat back, listening to the slow, rhythmic drip of water from the gutter outside. The house around him seemed to breathe, a living thing once more. In the weeks that followed, Harold continued to write, shaping the fragments of discovery into a coherent story. He visited the library often, speaking with Dr. Moore and the archivist, filling in the missing details. Together, they gathered everything: photographs, copies of letters, news clippings, even recordings of interviews with the descendants of the Johnson family. It was no longer just his story or theirs. It was a shared chronicle of endurance and remembrance. One evening, the museum curator invited Harold to attend the unveiling of a new exhibit built around the discovery. The display would include the safe, restored but still marked by rust, and a replica of the letters and photograph. The curator asked if he would say a few words at the opening. Harold agreed, though the thought of speaking in front of a crowd made his stomach tighten. When the day arrived, he stood at the podium, looking out over the small gathering of visitors, historians, and families. Behind him, under soft museum lighting, the safe stood open, its contents carefully arranged inside. The letters, the blanket, the metal, all preserved, all finally seen. He cleared his throat and began to speak. He told them about the day of the discovery, about the feeling of the soil giving way beneath the excavator, about how something inside him had shifted when he saw what lay beneath. He spoke not of tragedy, but of continuity, of the way stories refused to die when someone was willing to listen. His voice trembled at times, but the words came steady. He finished simply, saying, "We are all, in one way or another, caretakers of memory. The earth keeps it, but it's our duty to bring it to light." When the applause came, it was gentle, respectful. People lingered afterward, touching the glass of the exhibit case, whispering to one another. Harold stood off to the side, watching as children pressed their hands against the display, their eyes wide with wonder. He felt the faintest smile rise on his lips. That evening, when he returned home, the house glowed with a quiet warmth. The setting sun cast long stripes of light through the kitchen window, gilding the walls in amber. He went outside to the yard, where the air was still and heavy with summer. The oak's branches swayed slightly, their leaves whispering against one another like pages turning in an old book. He sat on the bench and looked toward the memorial. The grass had grown thick around the stone now, small wildflowers blooming near its base. Life had returned in every sense. As twilight deepened, he thought of his wife again, the way she used to hum as she worked in the garden, the way she believed that love and care could coax life from even the hardest ground. He smiled at the thought. Perhaps she had been right all along. The soil did remember kindness. It remembered everything. He stayed there until night fully fell, the stars unfolding slowly above the city's muted glow. The air was cool against his skin, and for a long time he didn't move. The past and the present seemed to blend together in the darkness. The laughter of his children, the imagined voices of the Johnsons, the echo of his own heartbeat steady in the quiet. When he finally rose to go inside, he glanced once more at the stone, its inscription silvered in moonlight. He whispered a few words, not of farewell, but of gratitude, and turned toward the house. Behind him, the oak rustled softly, its branches swaying as if in acknowledgment. Inside, he paused at the doorway and looked back one last time. The house stood firm, no longer a place haunted by silence, but a home anchored in remembrance. The safe was gone, but what it had revealed would endure, etched into history, rooted in the earth, and carried in the hearts of those who knew its story. And so, beneath the great oak where generations had lived and lost and hoped again, the earth remembered. It remembered the storm, the fire, the love, and the hands that had built and rebuilt upon it. And as the night deepened, that memory settled once more into the soil, not as a secret this time, but as a legacy. If this story moved you, don't leave just yet. Hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Watch the next episode right here and explore more incredible true life stories on our channel. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, share this video with someone today.